Somebody needs to stand back there at the door and hand this to me and say, "Put it on." So I would have it on before I get up here. I apologize for the delay. Had a good song, good prayer, and just need to get right into the lesson. Be turning to Matthew 19. Matthew chapter 19. We covered through verse 10 last time of Matthew 19, the things that Jesus has to say about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And the point that I want to make tonight, or some points I want to make tonight about this particular section, is that Jesus reveals His position. And His position, of course, is always right, isn't it? Whatever He addresses or addressed while He was upon earth and still addresses to us today through His Word, we know that it's correct because Jesus is the truth, as seen in John 14:6. Therefore, He speaks the truth. His Word is the truth, and we can stake our claim and take our position on what Jesus said, and we'll be right on any subject. And so I want you to notice that He emphasizes about 4 or 5 things about the marriage arrangement that He has discussed. Let's go back and look at this again just briefly. The Pharisees have come to Jesus and asked Him the question, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause or for any reason? Is basically what they're asking. And He answered and said to them, have you not read that He who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain or two shall be one flesh? Wherefore they are no more two or twain, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. They say unto Him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? And He said unto them, Moses, because the hardness of your heart, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, commits adultery. And whoso marries her who is put away, commits adultery. Now, in verse 10, His disciples say to Him, now the scene is changing here from the Pharisees to the disciples. And we want to talk about verses 10, 11, and 12 in just a moment, or a few minutes. But I want you to notice that Jesus emphasizes 4 important principles. Number 1 is permanence, the permanence of marriage. It is very clear that marriage is an important part of life as God would have it. Because when He created life, it involved the formation of the home and family. That makes it the oldest divine institution. And it is absolutely necessary in order for the human race to continue. To multiply and replenish the earth was the responsibility given to Adam and Eve and to their descendants as well. God would renew that command later on and that principle. But I want us to remember that God's law regarding marriage is permanent. It doesn't change with cultural trends and with the preferences of people. People can talk about gay marriage all they want. God does not recognize that as legitimate because He made a man and a woman. Had he been in favor of it, he would have created either two men or two women, obviously. Marriage relationships, then, should be viewed by the participants as permanent. And we all view that. What is the exception? Jesus states it, except it be for fornication. I've known a few preachers who said and took the position that there was no reason, no scriptural reason, that would be recognized by God to allow a divorce. But the except word is very easily understood. Except it be for fornication. That exception statement is just as true as the other part of that verse. And so we can talk about the guilty party and the innocent party. The party that is guilty of fornication has committed a very grievous sin. But does the innocent party then have to bear the brunt of that and never have the right to remarry? Now, when it comes to remarrying in situations like this, you need to be very careful. I've talked to people on occasions and pointed out you need to be sure you are eligible to remarry, and you need to be sure that you marry someone if you choose to remarry. You don't have to remarry. You need to choose someone who is eligible as well. And people say, well, preacher, that really gets into a difficult situation. That's right. Because sin makes things difficult. Remember, plan of salvation is simple, easily understood. Sin is very complex, and it makes life difficult for us. But remember, and this will help you to keep things in perspective, marriage was intended by the Almighty from the beginning to be permanent in its nature. Now, notice, it is what God has joined together. Who does the joining? Well, such and such a preacher married us. He performed the ceremony as an agent of the state. Justice of the peace can do that. I believe an airplane pilot can't he? I know a ship's captain can. There may be others where it would be recognized. I think a high-ranking county official, a county judge, what we used to call the county judge, can do wedding ceremonies. But notice, it is what God has joined together, Jesus said. That is not to put asunder. Now, since God does the joining, when a human being decides to put that asunder, to whom will they answer? God. Because He's the one that joined them. And it's hard for preachers or people doing ceremonies to know all the whys and wherefores and all of that, but God does, doesn't He? He knows everything. Second point, Jesus emphasizes purity. Number one is permanence. Number two is purity. Christians are guided by a very simple principle. It's stated in 1 Timothy 5, verse 22. Paul told Timothy, keep yourself pure. 3 words, keep yourself pure. In marriage, that is applicable too, isn't it? Both parties in the marriage have a responsibility to keep themselves pure. Notice in verse 9, adultery and fornication are both mentioned. When you go to Galatians 5:19, beginning with that verse, Paul lists the works of the flesh. What are the first two? Anybody remember? Adultery and fornication. Those are the first two. Now, what does that tell you? The adultery and fornication in Matthew 19:9 are things that defile the people involved in the marriage relationship. Sin is said to be dirty. How do we know it's dirty? Because we need to be cleansed from it. Sin pollutes us, doesn't it? Not just these two sins. Sin in general is polluting by its very nature. Now, think Matthew 19:9. Adultery, fornication. The first two works of the flesh that are mentioned in Galatians 5:19. And what is said about those sins that accompany adultery and fornication in Galatians 5:19? Those two and all the rest that are listed there.
They're abominations.
I'm sorry?
They're abominations.
They're abominations, but they will prevent you from what?
Eternal life.
That's right, entering into the kingdom. They'll keep you out of the kingdom, keep you out of heaven. But when you start reading Galatians 5:22 through 33, or 23 rather, 22 and 23, you will find such things as love, goodness, and self-control. Now those are said to be three of the fruits of the Spirit. If you do those or put those things into practice in your life, you're going to live a pure life. You're going to avoid the works of the flesh that will defile you and make you dirty. Now, go back to Matthew 15, verses 19 and 20, where the Pharisees are again arguing with Jesus about what defiles a man. And they said, your disciples eat grain on the Sabbath day. You know, they're defiled. Jesus in verses 19 and 20 of that chapter says, it's not the things that go into your body that defile you. It's the things that come out. And it's interesting that he says, adulteries and fornications defile a man. So that shows us that Jesus in Matthew 19 is saying, keep the marriage relationship pure. Keep it pure. It's to be permanent. It's to be pure. There is to be a priority attached to it. How do we know that? Because he said, you leave your father and mother, you cleave to your wife. Those are very significant terms and they go hand in hand. Leaving denotes a breaking of the ties. You've heard the expression, you got a loose apron string. Lots of marriages flounder and fail because the apron strings are still attached. And Junior never really grows up and becomes a man and doesn't accept the responsibility that he needs to do. And sometimes it's the other way around. I'm afraid to use a name, so I'll just use Juniorette. Juniorette decides that, she's got to run to Mommy and Daddy every time anything happens. And so, she doesn't grow up and develop as she should. And they don't learn to function as a team. They pull against one another instead of pulling together. But what is happening here is there is the establishment of a new entity. It's another home. And it is to function independently. This husband, Junior's now the head of the family. That doesn't mean that he's a dictator. He's not a totalitarian. He is not the proverbial boss. Because, you see, if he loves his wife and he has self-control, he's going to be the kind of husband that God wants him to be. And she, on the other hand, has respect for her husband like Sarah did Abraham. How many women in here tonight call your husbands Mr.? Barbara and I used to go home with a couple from Baghdad. And Mr. Ray's first wife had died. And so he married was she Miss Duke or Mrs.? Miss Duke. She had never been married. So in later life, he married Miss Duke. When we would go home with them to eat, it was always so amusing. She called him Mr. Ray. And it was evident that she respected him very much so. He was several years older than she. But she, in a very dignified way, she called him Mr. Ray. Mr. Ray, what would you care for some dessert? Mr. Ray, would you like this? You want some tea, coffee, whatever. Always called him Mr. Ray. But I had never met anybody, never known a couple that did that until we met them. But I thought it was right sweet and kind. She was respectful to him, and as far as I know, he was to her as well. I never saw anything to the contrary. But that's the way it ought to be. Jesus' words are, they are no more two, but one flesh. Now, if you want a divine commentary on that, read Ephesians 5, 22 through 33, where Paul talks to the husbands and wives in the church at Ephesus and reminds them of the fact that they are no longer two. In fact, Paul refers to this very statement from the book of Genesis and from the lips of Jesus. I would suggest to you that priority in marriage means that nothing or no one except the Lord Himself is to come before one's spouse. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and there may be some who disagree. Not even your children. Now, we love our children. We do anything for them. But first and foremost, our responsibility is to one another. We're trying to rear our children so they can take care of themselves. And most children that I know love their parents, and they'll do anything they can to help them. But there's a devotion to your spouse that is God-given. Always remember that. And the fourth thing that I want you to remember is the practicality of this arrangement. That's the fourth P. Practicality. I mean, this is a practical arrangement. I've studied sociology some. I'm not an authority on that or anything else. But the home, the relationship, and the arrangement that's described right here in Matthew 19 and back in Genesis 1 and 2 is the most practical of all known to mankind. It'll work in any civilization where it's tried and put into practice. One man, one woman, deeply in love and committed to one another, will automatically have a support system, a security system, and anything else that you need. in order to make it in life. The home will serve to do that. I heard of a I think he was a denominational preacher, but he was persecuted beyond measure. All kinds of things were done to him because people didn't like what he preached about morality and things of that nature. And someone asked him one time, how in the world can you keep on doing this under such intense pressure and scrutiny and even danger? How can you keep on doing this? He gave a very simple answer. He said, I'm happy at home. And if I'm happy at home, I can stand anything. I think there's a good point there. There is a really good point for all of us to think about. 2 men or 2 women are not natural. 1 man and many women doesn't work. It won't work. You just read your Bible and you will see Sarah, Hagar, didn't work, did it? The wives of Jacob, didn't work. David's multiple wives, didn't work. It just is not according to nature. You will have all kinds of problems. You can't take 1 woman and many men. That won't work. What'll happen? Jealousy, envy, anger, resentment, physical harm, and sometimes even death occurs. Murders are committed because of a failure to recognize God's arrangement. Now, there's all kinds of social experimentation and engineering by the experts. All of that notwithstanding, I would suggest tonight that God's way is still by far the best. I think most of you, if not every one of you, would agree that that's true. So we need to have faith and courage to take a stand where God has spoken and not be ashamed of that. And just say, we're going to try our best to practice what God has taught in His Word and tell others about it as well. Any of you have any comments? I wanted to share some things with you on verses 10 through 12, where Jesus or His disciples say to Him, and one of the other accounts indicate that they have now gone into the house, a house. I don't know whose house it was, but into a house. And the disciples there said, if the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. There were some of the rabbis who said in their statements in Jewish writings, the Talmud and others, it says, if a woman doesn't please a man, he does an honorable thing by putting her away. I mean, there were people then who preached. A man could put away his wife for any reason. If he finds anything he doesn't like, he can put her away. And so this had been taught, and maybe the disciples are thinking, well, boy, you know, that's a far cry from what we've been taught by all these rabbis. So they wanted to ask Jesus about it, and they said, if that's the case, then it's not good to marry. Well, Jesus didn't want them to think that marriage was a terrible thing, because the Hebrews writer says marriage is honorable. Hebrews 13, verse 4. But Jesus said to them, all cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. Now, there's a lot of people that struggle with that. I just thought back a few days ago. We were in college, and some of the preacher students got up a little meeting where we would meet and discuss, certain passages of Scripture and certain issues that were being discussed. Of course, this was one that was being discussed. We came to this passage, and a lot of the boys had different ideas about it, and I just kept my mouth shut because I really never even thought that much about it. Never studied this particular passage that much. Finally, one of them said, "Ed, what do you think about it?" I said, "Well, I don't know really what I think about it, because I never thought about it." But I said, we all know what a eunuch is. This would be a man who would be incapable of functioning in a husband-wife relationship, basically speaking, and unable to beget children. Lots of the captives from the city of Jerusalem and Judah were taken into Babylon. And the conquering kings oftentimes would make eunuchs out of certain males. They believed that would make them more docile, easier going, and more loyal. Daniel was one of those men. And evidently Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. Daniel became a great man, a very highly honored man. But Jesus says there are three groups of eunuchs. Now, we know about the Ethiopian eunuch. Have you ever studied about the Ethiopian eunuch in the Old Testament? See if you can find him sometime. I preached a sermon on him a long time ago, and I hadn't thought of it until I was studying this. Notice there are eunuchs who were born from their mother's womb. Birth defects makes some men eunuchs. And obviously, remaining unmarried to those men doesn't present a difficult challenge at all regarding sexual needs and desires. There was a man that used to come to our farm to squirrel hunt. And everybody called him Lige. And Daddy and Mr. Lige were talking one day, and Daddy said, "Lige, why did you never marry?" And he said, "Well, Johnny, I've always thought about it this way. I'd lots rather to want something and not have it than to have something and not want it." Now, I don't know if you've ever heard anybody say it that way, but this man chose by choice. He was an old soldier, fought in World War II, but he was an exemplary citizen in every way. He just chose never to be married. And I'm mentioning this because I think sometimes people make a mistake. There are those who assume that anybody that doesn't marry is automatically gay or homosexual. And that is a sad mistake to make. That's not a logical deduction. Now, he said there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men. And that's what I was talking about earlier. This was very common among the Gentiles. The Jews detested that concept, but the Gentiles practiced it. But then there was one other group of eunuchs, those who made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom's sake. That is, because of their commitment to Christ, and their desire to be servants in His kingdom. Paul discusses this, I believe it's in 1 Corinthians 7, where he points out that those during times of tribulation who are not married have less concerns. They have fewer concerns. They would be worried sick about a spouse or a family. Paul was never married. He was an apostle, but he couldn't serve as an elder because he was not the husband of one wife. But he was an apostle of Jesus Christ. And he talks about how, self-control is very important. He said it's better to marry than to burn. And the burning there seems to have to do with passion and the desire for relationship and so on. But those are the three groups. Jesus says now, those people in those three categories would not be bothered one way or the other by what we have just said about marriage and the marriage relationship. So it doesn't apply to those people, is what he's saying. Are they to keep themselves pure in reference to other things? Well, certainly. Purity is more than just keeping yourselves pure sexually. There's other ways that we can become impure. But that in Paul's day and in the days of Jesus, especially among the Gentiles, was a really major problem. And I don't think it takes a Solomon to figure out that it is a major problem in our day as well. Appreciate you being here. I want to talk about the rich young ruler next time and a little bit about the little children. We'll come back to them in Matthew 19.